Thank you so much, Anne, and thank you for inviting me, and thank you, Jim and Marty, for being there and making this all possible. Am I talking too far from the mic, or is that okay in the back? So I wasn't at the film last night because I've seen it once and I don't think I could make it through again without crying. Although I did make it through the first time without crying. My 4-year-old granddaughter was diagnosed with cancer in June. Within the last 2 years, her mother, her uncle, and her aunt were all diagnosed with cancer. Oops, I got it right there. So I know that it's a terrible, terrible disease, and it needs to be prevented. And that's why we're all here. Okay. So what the subject is here, when we think about prevention, we have to think about blue-collar women's jobs. And I don't know anything about cancer research, although I know a lot about cancer. But I do know a lot about the absence of women from occupational health. I'm going to start out with when I started my career, and which was longer than 20 years ago, but there's been a number of research efforts to show how women are absent from occupational health research. And this was not because people are mean. This was because at the beginning, everybody looked at women's jobs and thought they looked like there was nothing there. And most people in the workplace were men. And so, very naturally, the men's jobs attracted the first attention of occupational health researchers. And especially because, we don't want to forget this, men's jobs have a lot of nasty things about them. I mean, men do have more occupational accidents than women. This is because when it looks obviously dangerous, we prefer to send it away. So, but this doesn't mean that we should ignore the important dangers in women's jobs. And so I'm going to ask two questions today. One is, why have we been neglecting women's jobs? And the other is, are things getting better? So, start with the first one. In 1994, Sheila Horzam, who's with the United States National Cancer Institute, did a study of the literature from 1971 to 1990, all the scientific literature. And she found that of all the cancer studies she could find, only 14% of them did any analyses of women's cancers at all. And 65% of them excluded women entirely from all the studies. By 2000, it hadn't gotten really very much better. Dr. Needhammer, Isabelle Needhammer from France did another survey, and she found that among the 65 cancer studies published in the major occupational health journals, they didn't even bother to write the gender for 8%. Probably that means they were all men. 46% were explicitly of men only. 45%, which is getting a little bit better, were mixed samples, but only 1% were entirely women, which means that nobody's studying breast cancer, nobody's studying ovarian cancer from an occupational health point of view. So this is 2000. Why is it that women's occupational health and in the area of cancer has been so neglected? Well, I asked that question to a leading Quebec researcher in the area of cancer and occupational health. And I said, how come you excluded all the women from your big study that cost me and the other Quebec taxpayers a couple of $1 million? And he said, well, it's a question of cost-benefit. There's too few women with occupational cancers. It's not worthwhile to study them. So I said, well, how do you know there's too few? And cost-benefit for me is like the cost is infinite compared to the benefit because I'm not getting anything out of it, right? But this didn't upset him at all because he thought I was trying to politicize science, which is not a good thing. Of course, he didn't politicize science when he excluded the women. There are a few excuses that he wasn't able to think of on his feet, which make a little bit more sense. One reason that we do know less about women's cancers, and they are harder to study, is that women's average seniority in jobs is lower. Women stay less long at the same job. Why? Because we're busy doing other things sometimes. And because we don't have the greatest career prospects, so it's not worth it that much to women to hang around in the same job. So, which is a good thing if your job involves being exposed to toxic chemicals. It might not be such a good thing for your income, which I'll talk about a little later. The other thing is that, again, when I was saying that when it looks dangerous, men are more likely to be sent in on the front lines. This is true of chemical exposures. When the exposures to chemicals are visible and scary looking, and you walk into the plant, and so dusty you can hardly breathe, you're likely to find it in there. It's when the chemicals are a little bit less visible, when there's these sort of invisible fumes rising up into your nose, then you can find them. And I don't know a lot about chemical exposures, and there's a lot of people going to be talking today that do, so I'm not going to spend my time doing it. But I do want to point out that this is typical of many areas in occupational health, where the exposures of men are pretty obvious and hit you in the eye, and the exposures of women are less visible. And that's why our research group is called Invisibility, because the unions recognized that we need to pay attention to some of these invisible things. I did a little analysis of the research supported by the Institute of Occupational Health and Safety Research in Quebec. It was done some years ago, and since I did it, they stopped publishing statistics on what they do research on. I don't want to take all the credit for this, but I know they were good. What I did was just analyze what the percentage of women were in the jobs that they were studying, and I'm wondering if I can use this thing as a pointer. Yes, sort of. Doesn't really work, does it? Yes, it does. Okay, so in this column, you see the percent of women in the job studied during the first 20 years that research was being done by the Occupational Health and Safety Institute. And we find that there's an average of 16% of women in the job, so that most of the jobs being studied are men's jobs, whereas the proportion of women in the workplace at the time we did the study was 46%. It's now 47%. So what this says is research hasn't been interested in women's jobs in general. And this makes what I'm calling a vicious circle, that is, that the research isn't done, the risks in women's jobs aren't identified, and therefore, since you don't know that the women in these jobs are exposed to horrible chemicals or exposed to horrible working conditions physically in general or mentally or emotionally, then when women start complaining about their jobs, you know women complain all the time, right, for nothing. Because it looks like it's for nothing because we haven't done the research, we haven't identified the risk. And so it's hysteria, it's complaining. And it used to be, in fact, that when they were diagnosing what was called mass hysteria, one of the diagnostic criteria for distinguishing real exposures to chemicals from imaginary exposures to chemicals was the proportion of women in the sample. That was actually suggested officially by doctors. So you can be not surprised that therefore there's little interest and little attention paid to women's occupational health. And therefore, the research isn't done because it's obvious that women don't get occupational cancers, for example. Therefore, it's not worthwhile studying them, and we go around again. And that results, unfortunately, with a deficit in prevention. So I'm just going to go quickly through the priority sectors in Quebec. Quebec has ranked all the employment sectors in order of priority. There are 6 groupings. Rated from 1 to 6, where the highest priority is the construction industry. There are other sectors in this area. I'm just giving, like, forestry is in there as well. I'm just giving sample employment sectors. So the first sector is construction. The second has got metallurgy. The third has public administration and all the government employees. And so you can understand why a lot of the prevention is is concentrated in sectors 1 and 2, because if you put it in sector 3, then you have to get into the government and get the government to be doing prevention with its own employees, which they would find very expensive, so they stopped a lot of things in sector 2. And then the low priorities are commerce, services, and health, which is really weird because health is a place where there are a lot of visible dangers. Well, before I show you, you're going to be able to guess what the percentage of women is and how that relates to the priority level of the sector. So this is the percentage of women, and as the priority of the sector gets lower, the proportion of women gets higher. So you could think, well, that's because there's no dangers in these sectors, so what I put in the next column, that you haven't seen yet, is the proportion of women, of pregnant women, who are allowed leave. This means if they're allowed precautionary pregnancy leave, what that means is the same organization, the same Quebec Compensation Board, has determined that there's a danger for the fetus in these jobs. Okay? So if the women's jobs were really not dangerous, then women wouldn't be getting these precautionary leaves. Okay? Well, you can't, unfortunately, I blocked out some of those. But what you can see is that the priority for precautionary leave goes up with the proportion of women. And this is not because there's more women in the lower sectors, because it's rates per 1,000 pregnant women, okay? And what this is telling us is that the construction sector is a lot safer for women than the health sector, which shouldn't surprise anybody. And what it means is that their priorities for prevention have excluded women. Now, this is a lot of complicated mathematical reasoning. As if I lost everybody or not? No. Okay. You're smarter than me. Usually people I give seminars to. Okay, so, and let's just remember, because we've been talking about women in general, but I do want to talk about women who are in low-paid jobs, because women in low-paid jobs are the ones that are really getting. And I'll show you some proof of that in a minute. And just to remind you, in 2008, right now, today, women earn about 71% of men for full-time, full-year work. And that has not changed much since 1993. In fact, it hasn't changed much since 1980. Women still work more hours than men. Men still get paid for more of their work hours. And therefore, what I'm saying is the health of lower-paid women really needs attention. And I stole some slides from Dr. Susan Stock, who used to live in Windsor, so maybe some of you know her. What she did was very interesting. She looked first at musculoskeletal disorders. So we're far from cancer, but we're in musculoskeletal disorders that are work-related. And the question is, do women or men get more compensated musculoskeletal disorders? And we should recall, when we're thinking about these numbers, that Catherine Appel has shown that women have a much harder time getting compensated for their musculoskeletal disorders, and in fact for many categories of work-related disorders than men. So here it shouldn't be surprising that men have about 1.5 times as many compensated work-related disabling musculoskeletal disorders. They have about 1.5 times as many as women. But if we look at manual workers, we see something completely different. If we look at manual workers, we see that women get more compensated musculoskeletal disorders than men, and despite their disadvantage in claiming. Okay? And that these musculoskeletal disorders of women are, not surprisingly, because women do a lot of this repetitive movements with their arms and holding their arms up, which gives them neck pain, so that the excess can be found mostly in the neck and arms. And upper back, but you don't see it because the stupid way they did the little picture. You can't tell the difference between upper back and lower back. So what I'm saying here is that if you consider, you must look at women doing manual work, women doing low-paid work specifically. In my area, ergonomics, women's jobs are not safe, despite the fact that they look safe. That's what I'm trying to say about this. And as I mentioned, it's harder for women to get compensated. And women's absences from musculoskeletal disorders were longer than men's, lasted longer. Women stay out of work longer, and that's a million jurisdictions that people have looked at. So why am I talking about musculoskeletal disorders when we're supposed to be talking about cancer? Well, I can't talk a lot about the research on women's occupational cancer because there isn't a lot of research on women's occupational cancer. But I can tell you that what you have to look out for based on what I've seen about women's musculoskeletal disorders and how they've been ignored and undercompensated and underprevented especially. Things are looking up a little bit. There are a growing number of studies. There are a number of people, François Gresh in Quebec, or Sheila Zam in the United States, who are making it their business to push for research on women's occupational cancers, and I hope that that will succeed. I just, when you're ignorant, you have to tell about what you do know. So the only thing I know about chemicals and women's jobs comes from studies that we've been doing of cleaners. And we've been studying cleaners now for the last, 20 years almost. And these are pictures of men cleaners and women's cleaners. And you can't probably see them because of the lighting, but it used to be that jobs were explicitly divided in hospital cleaning between women's cleaning and men's cleaning. Now they call it light cleaning and heavy cleaning. So we've really advanced socially. But what it is that the men spend most of their time mopping floors with this lotion, and they get carpal tunnel syndrome. And the women spend their time really rushing around and dusting and cleaning toilets. That's light. So this illustrates that even in the same job, women and men don't do the same work. In the hospital cleaning job, men do more for vacuuming and floor polishing. Women clean more bathrooms, which means that they're exposed to a whole bunch of stuff that the men are not exposed to. And now they're trying to desegregate the jobs in Quebec, and that's a whole other very sad story, which has resulted in a lot of women losing their jobs. But even when the jobs have been fused so that they don't call it light work and heavy work anymore, they just call it actually heavy work, and everybody does it. The men still don't clean bathrooms. One guy told us, "I don't clean bathrooms at home, why should I do it at work?" Therefore, women and men may be exposed to different chemicals at the same workplace, so we have to be aware of that. Women may be exposed to different doses of the chemicals. When they started cutting before everybody figured out that, whoops, if the bathrooms weren't clean, everybody was going to get sick. They started cutting cleaning jobs massively in Quebec and I think everywhere in Canada. And what that did was that people, like when they're cleaners, they like to see the place being clean afterwards. You don't get a whole lot of recognition as a cleaner in a hospital, but you can look yourself at the floor and see that it's clean. You can look yourself at the bathroom and it cleans. So at least you've got that kind of satisfaction. Well, if you want to get that kind of satisfaction in your work area has been tripled, the only way you're going to get it is by using chemicals undiluted. And that's what they're starting to do. So that's a reason, and that's mostly women. They may have less ventilation where they work, and this applies to factory jobs where women can be concentrated in specific areas and not move around as much as men. That's a universal in women's jobs. Women's low-paid jobs, men go from one place to another, the women stay in the same space. Women's noses and mouths are going to be closer to the chemical because we're smaller. So if you're working over a bench, your nose might be closer. Women may be more rushed because their jobs usually involve working very fast. So, and this is my message in the last slide. While we're waiting for the research on women's cancer to come up with what exactly among the 60,000 or so chemicals that we're exposed to, what each one might be associated with as a risk level, and that may take a little bit of time, I want to give you a message from ergonomics, which is that we've got a new science in ergonomics called ergotoxicology. It was developed actually by a number of different foci in in Canada and in France. And what it is how can you reduce your exposure to chemicals in the real work area? It's no use making regulations that say that you have to reduce your exposure to chemicals if the working conditions are such that you can't. If you have to use your chemicals undiluted. If you don't have time to be careful with the chemicals. If you don't have time to put on a mask. If you can't hear in your workplace, so you can't be warned when somebody's becoming around chemicals. So you really have to think about the real life conditions of exposure to chemicals. And make it easier for workers to protect themselves despite all the rising pressures to work faster. And of course you need information, which is why we're all here for this conference. And I'm hoping that it's going to be a really, really profitable conference.